and welcome to the next edition of Mixing Light's Office Hours. And I have with me as panelists on this call, I've got Zeb Chadfield coming out from the UK. Are you in the UK today, Zeb?
Yes. I'm in London on this occasion. Yes.
Yeah, you're the man of the world, so I never know where in Europe you might be at any given time. And then Joey, we missed each other 2 weeks ago. Joey Deanna is with us as well. Joey, we missed each other 2 weeks ago. You were here in Orlando, and Hurricane Ian came through and messed up our plans. We were going to live stream this call from here with both of us, and I was doing hurricane prep, and I couldn't make it. So,
and I was cannonballing in a 14-hour drive in the world's worst rental car home because planes don't work in hurricanes.
Yeah, no, planes don't work in hurricanes. This is true. So, and we've got 4 questions lined up for today's office hours, and we're going to skip our normal kind of pre-banter and jump right into these because these are good, and some of these may require some going back and forth with us. And we were hoping to be sharing screens, but that doesn't seem to be working on the account right now. I'll have to find out why. So we can do some of the screen sharing in post-production. I can, kind of just record stuff and show what we want to show. So feel free to narrate anything you're doing on the screen, and I'll drop that in for the long tail when we drop this into the Insights library. And so we're going to start out on the very first question. Lucas V, he asks, what is the forward OOTF option in CST, which is the color space transform, Resolve Effects plugin, which you use for color management in the node tree? He explains, I already know I should use it when I'm going from a scene transfer function, which we're going to talk about, to a display and, in quotes, inverse OOTF. Otherwise, but it bothers me to use it blindly. In other words, he knows when to use it. He just doesn't know why. I understand the answer may be complex for office hours, maybe, but if you can at least direct me to where I can find the answer myself, thank you. That's for Lucas. So, gentlemen, who wants to pick that up first?
I would be happy to.
Go, Joey, go.
All right. So this is actually one that we get a lot because Blackmagic introduced those checkboxes in, I guess, Resolve 17 in the latest edition of the color space transform, and it introduced, I think, like a massive amount of confusion. And it really didn't need to because it's actually a relatively simple thing that you don't need to mess with. So, but just to get some understanding here, I'd like to go back and deconstruct it a little bit. What is an OOTF? What is an EOTF? And what is a OETF? They're all transfer functions. You go from one thing to another, right? So an EOTF is an electro-optical transfer function. You go from an electronic signal, whether it be an analog video signal or a digital code value, whatever, to an optical image, a light value transfer function. So EOTF. A display has an EOTF. It takes electronic input, makes actual light. Okay? An OETF is the opposite. A camera has an OETF. It takes optical light, makes it into electronic information with its transfer function. So what is an OOTF? An opto-optical transfer function. Well, if you're going from what a display outputs to what a camera inputs, or vice versa, what a camera inputs to what a display outputs, that's what an OOTF does. So yes, the question is right. You use it when you go from a scene referred, or basically what is the light in the scene, what's in front of the sensor, to a display function, or from a display function to a scene function. So basically, if you're bouncing between log C and then, Rec 709 and trying to encode that into a log C, which you can do for some things, it doesn't work for other things, but that is where you would use an OOTF. What isn't well documented, and I think what confuses a lot of people, is the checkboxes in the color space transform are, for all intents and purposes, automatic. When you change the source in the color space transform, it's labeled as gamma, but they actually mean transfer function because that gamma could be an EOTF or it could be an OETF. But when you change the input gamma and the output gamma, it populates those checkboxes automatically for you. So when you go through the color space transform, give it gamma 2.4 as an input and a log C as an output. You'll see it will turn on the inverse OOTF. Vice versa, it'll turn on the other one. If you go from a log space to another log space, it won't turn them on. So I honestly don't know of a single situation where you would want to change those checkboxes besides what they're automatically populated when you put in your source and destination gamma or transfer function. Let the color space transform pick those checkboxes for you. I don't know why they're even there as options, except to confuse people.
Well, it's interesting, Joey.
Now, I shouldn't say that because more options is always good. And I bet some really clever color scientists could come up with a workflow where you're going to need to turn one of those on or off. And
if you're using custom math, right? I mean, I can absolutely imagine that one of the big shops with color scientists on their payroll have a need where it's like, no. I'm doing some of this transfer within my math. I need to turn that off. You need to give me that control.
That is handling that, or they might have a custom LUT that's handling some of that. But for most purposes, the forward and inverse OOTFs automatically populate, and there's nothing in the UI to tell you that they're automatically populating, except for when you start changing those values, you'll see the checkboxes turn on and off.
Yeah, and
so I think that's where a lot of people get confused.
It is, and Jim in the chat notes that the explanation in the manual is equally confusing. The answer to a lot of these questions for DaVinci Resolve is check the manual, because the manual traditionally is really good. But when new features roll out, it can take them up to a year to kind of really get into explaining in the manual in a way that is actually actionable.
Yeah, and Jim, to follow up on your other comment in the chat, it is not about going from a small or a big color space. It's only related to the transfer function. So the luminance transfer function that, again, the color space transform effect labels as gamma, even if it's not a gamma function, but it's only related to those two options. So the color space source and destination won't affect these at all, because all the color space is basically doing is saying, here's your primaries, here's what they represent, and here's the gamut associated with it. So you're kind of warping the color that way, and that's what the gamut mapping options relate to.
And we've had Jamie Dickinson join us here on the call. Jamie, thanks for showing up.
Jamie, welcome. Good to see you.
Good to see you. But managed to dive in at the last minute there.
Yeah, we're talking about the forward OOTF option in the color space transform plugin. Zeb, did you have, or Jamie, did either of you have anything to add to that conversation?
I've got something that's not quite on the same topic, but just a pet peeve of mine. I was just trying to find exactly how it was worded in the color management settings, but with the DaVinci color management, the inverse DRT for SDR to HDR conversion, I hate that thing. I asked them about disabling it because it's on by default, and often if you've gone too far with the project and it's on, you don't want to take it off because it's going to then have a knock-on effect to any shots that you may have worked on. But it's one of those things that it tends to just do a terrible job of basically trying to pull your SDR into HDR. I don't know if Joey has more insight into that.
I live the Aces life 90% of the time, so I don't have much insight into that because I love the way Aces goes from SDR to HDR, which is somewhat related to our next question.
It is. So we'll go ahead. Jamie, unless you have something to add, we can go ahead and jump into...
I will ask, what is a DRT? That's a DaVinci Resolve?
DaVinci Resolve Transform. It's their labeling for the internal color space transforms that happen when you use Resolve Color Management.
All right, so let's
kind
head
of like
over
an IDT or an ODT, except not Aces.
Yeah.
So jump now into question number 2 from Clement B. How many hours would I need to do an HDR grade pass for a feature film, roughly? And he goes on to say, I have to do an SDR grade for a 100-minute feature film early next year. It's 12 scenes. I'm only equipped for SDR, so he plans on working with ACES Color Transform, node-based color management. And then he writes, we want later on to do an HDR pass and then do the Dolby metadata process. We will rent a HDR ready suite. We think it will be less expensive that way. We want to do an HDR pass if we're able to sell the film to platforms like Netflix. And then he mentions, and we'll come up, well, and he mentions I like Walter Volpato's view about HDR. And I emailed him afterwards, said, well, what exactly about Walter's approach do you like? And it's the node-based color management, the thing that, Joey teaches, doing ACES within the nodes as opposed to project-wide, where you go into your project preferences and set up ACES that way. So, gentlemen, 100-minute film. You do the grade in SDR, and now you want to do a Dolby Vision pass, which also necessitates first just doing a standard HDR grade, right? Dolby Vision is post doing the HDR grade. So let's start with the HDR grade. How much time? Let's start with the SDR. 100-minute film. How much time do you guys normally take for a feature film to grade a 100-minute film? Jamie, start with you.
Yeah, go with Jamie.
Yeah, well, when did I last do a proper feature? I think I've heard this advice that you should do basically 10 days for a feature. And that includes some sort of review passes. And as always, the answer is it depends. But I would start at that, 2 5-day weeks. You're going to be back and forth. If you've got reviews remotely, that can add a lot of the time. But if people are signing off in the suite right there with you, that can be, well, that depends on the client. That can go much slower. It can go much quicker. So, yeah, 10 days would be my starting point.
What about you, Zeb?
Yeah, for us, I guess the way that I communicate with clients in terms of timings really comes down to the detail that is going to be going into the film or the program. So it's never quite so black and white, because if one project comes in and ultra tight budget just needs to be turned over and made to look acceptable, you might be doing like a 2 or a 3 day, like a very fast turnaround sort of thing. And we'll sort of say, look, as long as everyone in this equation understands that is me hitting the buttons until I get to the end and making it look as good as I can. As soon as you get a DOP or a director or people that start to have differences of opinions, that's going to blow out that time frame, and it can't be completed at that kind of pace, And so it's very much a case of kind of figuring that out. And so even with, long form television work and everything else, for one broadcaster, the budget might allow us a day. Another broadcaster might allow us a week. And another one might be saying, yeah, we're going to be putting this into festivals or we're getting a theatrical release and we want 15 days on it or more even. So, and our conversation with them is just like, it's, they'll kind of say, how long do you need for this? And we'll say, well, I can continue to add layers and layers and layers of detail. And so I could do that almost indefinitely. So what we need to do is actually figure out where the budget sits, and then we can kind of hone in on how much work we can do and what that means for the film.
Yeah, actually, sorry. I just remembered that I did do a feature doc just recently, and I was budgeted 2 days to do it and 1 day review with the DP. And I did it. I thought that was a bit of an ask, but it was shot really well, and I did it, and it worked pretty well. And I didn't even have a panel. That was all mouse and keyboard.
Yeah, I would just say, all of those disclaimers that you guys mentioned aside, what they actually need, how much budget they have, will do variables, right? Road to Galena, which I've talked about on Mixing Light recently, kind of lined up exactly with what Jamie was saying. It was 2 weeks of grading. Now, granted, that doesn't mean 2 weeks, 1 week, then the next week, right? You can, depending on your schedule, you might work on it a day, and then it might take longer than that. But in terms of actual billable grading time, that film was right around 2 weeks, and that was with really good photography, with kind of a focus on the creative side, working with the DP and the director. In general, I think that kind of 2-week guideline is good, and then you kind of add or subtract based on the individual needs of the project. It is kind of a little bit like asking, how much does a boat cost?
Yeah, my experience pretty much runs with you guys. I tend to, a lot of my clients are indie and lower budget or documentary filmmakers. And, for a lot of these clients, the color grade is like an aspirational awesome. We're able to do it. I can't believe it, right? And for those clients, I find that, I'm usually billing about 5 days for them, is about the turnaround time on jobs like that. On features where they have budgets, it's usually in the 7-day range, and then a day or two on either side. There's the conform day, there's the deliver day, and so you end up with about 2 weeks to get the whole thing done. I don't usually bill a full 10 days on a like a 100-minute feature. It's probably usually around 6 or 7 to get that initial grade done. Jamie, are you in a theater? Do you have a projector?
I have been working in a place just on and off that does have a projector. I did a short film on one recently. I didn't much like that experience. I really found that unless it's completely dark, that's, your calibration is off, and it kind of wasn't. No, generally I'm on if I'm doing something at home, I've got an Asus monitor here or a Sony BVM. I'm more comfortable on those, really.
Got it. Do you guys, Joey or Zeb, do you guys ever grade in a theater?
I've never graded in a theater.
No.
I will say this. There's a lot of talk about display technology, and people in general prefer the top emission RGB OLEDs, like the Sonys and the Flanderses that were the 25-inch HD OLEDs that everybody loved for so long. I've got one sitting in the back there. I have to say, for features that are going to go to theatrical, since I have moved to a LCD-based reference monitor, it has been it was a very, very good analog to the projection. So when we graded in Aces the feature that I just finished, we did it entirely on the XM310K, which is a LCD local dimming monitor, and we were lucky that our premiere was at a local theater here that is a really highly regarded theater. Like they host festivals. They are in the film community, so they take the projection really seriously. Sometimes you go into a theater and you don't know what you're going to get. When the last time their projector was calibrated, how old the lamp is. It's a little bit of a mixed bag sometimes when you make a DCP and play it in a theater, and it might not match exactly. Well, our premiere for this film was at a very, very good, highly regarded theater, and their projector was very well recently calibrated. And I'll tell you what, when they pulled up that DCP and we did a little test screening of it, I mean, there was no surprises. It looked exactly how I felt it looked in the suite. And that, as one, after having kind of developed the color management pipeline and everything, seeing it to completion and seeing it in a calibrated theater and having it just not have any surprises. Even the director commented, he's like, this looks exactly like it looked in the suite. This is amazing. That was really cool. But to go into the actual content of the question a little bit more, because now, so far we've just been talking about SDR, whether you're going from a monitor to a theater or whatever. We're talking about SDR. Now you're going to HDR. I think your approach here is absolutely wonderful. Do your creative grade in SDR in a calibrated environment where you're confident, because confidence in your calibration is very important. Make it creatively happy where everybody is in good shape with it. And then, rent a suite somewhere to trim it up to HDR. I think that's a much, much, much better approach than, I'm going to buy a consumer HDR monitor, try to Kentucky windage it into working and calibrating and work around it. And, there's so many problems with consumer monitors and HDR mastering, not viewing, that I think just grading where you can be very confident in your monitoring. If that's SDR, great. and then going to somewhere that has the monitoring that you need to do the HDR mastering process when you've done 80 to 90% of the creative work for that HDR grade in a color managed pipeline. Now, he mentioned working at Ace's node base, which obviously I agree with. I love that workflow. Any kind of scene record color management will work for this type of workflow, right? You could be project wide, RCM, you still get the same advantages, right? How you do the color management is just logistic at that point. The idea is grading in that wide gamut space for a monitor that you have confidence in, that you know is calibrated, getting your creative grade done, and then getting the monitor for HDR and trimming up by changing your output transform. In general...
Sorry, I was just going to ask a question about that. If you've done the creative SDR, but then you do the HDR, but then part of the HDR Dolby trims will be the metadata to create an SDR. So how would you deliver those?
So that's going to depend. I literally just went through this process on the road to Galena, so it's interesting. Trimming up to HDR with color management, the things you're going to look for are things that matter in HDR. Highlights, color in highlights, right? Because in SDR, you might have some peaky highlights, and they don't look too bad because, yes, maybe they clipped, but when SDR highlights clip, they clip at white, right? HDR highlights don't clip. So you could flip your ODT and look at it on an HDR monitor, and then all your highlights are pink. They might not have been pink in your creative SDR grade. That's what you need to look at when you're doing that HDR trim pass. Then you also need to look at creatively, what do you want to go into that expanded dynamic range? How do you want to use it? How aggressive do you want to be? Because the more aggressive you are, the harder and longer it can take sometimes when you're wrangling those highlights and areas where you're getting brighter and brighter and brighter. So, I mean, the actual question is, how many hours would I need? Again, it is how much does a boat cost? But the general guideline I would say is maybe 10 to 20% of the hours you put into the grade of the film. If your color management was good and you didn't do anything sketchy like clipping highlights or using LUTs in the middle of it or things like that. Sometimes if you use plugins, those can get really wonky when you go from SDR to HDR. Film grain can get wonky when you go from SDR to HDR, so you want to readdress that. Again, that's why it's really, really important when you're doing this kind of workflow to, like Clement said in his question, go someplace that has a real HDR monitor, because you want to be able to clearly see how those changes affect it. But when it comes to doing so you go SDR, HDR, then Dolby Vision, you go back to SDR, right? And that SDR trim is making metadata that dictates how the tone mapping is done on playback. What I have found when I'm doing this process is that if I pull in my bespoke SDR grade as a reference and wipe to it in Resolve and use my Dolby trim controls to kind of match that as closely as possible, man, does it look good. Even the down converted SDR from the Dolby Vision can be made to match your bespoke SDR really, really well. However, I wouldn't recommend going and then redoing DCPs from that SDR, right? If you've already made approved SDR bespoke versions, use those for your SDR deliverables. If you are going to a Netflix that requires one master deliverable, obviously that SDR will come from the derived SDR, and you want to take the time to make those Dolby trims as good as possible. And that's going to add another 10 to 20% of your time, right? So I would say 10 to 20% to make the HDR up trim, then another 10 to 20% to make the SDR down trim to do the Dolby Vision workflow. Again, with all the caveats of every project is different.
And that sounds about right. I mean, but remember though, my experience on this has been, I forgot to budget time for the play downs of each of these. It's 100 minutes to watch it once. Yep. Now I've got to watch 100 minutes for the HDR trim plus time to tweak. Then 100 minutes after the Dolby Vision analysis plus time to tweak, right? So I've just added a half day of literally simply watching the timeline. And that actually bit me. I ended up losing, like a day of billable time because I didn't put in the watch time for a full length, movie. Just the mechanics of having to watch every single shot.
Just to keep the boat analogy going, any boat costs more than you think it's going to cost.
Yeah. And so, and if it's your first time through it, you need to then pad another 20 or 30%, and you're probably still going to eat some time anyway, just kind of learning experience, right? And I don't like billing clients for my learning experience. So you'll probably end up, putting in some extra time that you're not billing for. But, keep in mind that, you do have to watch these things all the way down. My experience has been about yours, Joey. That sounds about right to me. A day for the HDR, a day for the Dolby, maybe a little less for the Dolby Vision. Maybe a half day for the Dolby Vision.
I will say this too: if you're
really
going into a rented suite, budget some time for getting familiar with the suite too. Like, you could be super familiar with how you normally work. You're going into somebody else's place now. You're going to need to figure out a couple things and get comfortable.
Yeah, file paths will be different, maybe, and so there are weird things that you have to work out when you're going into a rented space. Hopefully, they'll give you a little time, like gratis, maybe the night before. Hey, come in for a couple hours. We won't bill you for it. Get comfortable, get set up. So when you walk in tomorrow, you're ready to go with a client behind you. That type of thing. Zeb, what about you? Do you have much to say on this?
Yeah, I mean, we as a company tend to avoid that process because we do like the result of doing our HDR and then what Dolby Vision gives us in terms of, I generally feel like the quality of what we produce ends up being better than if we had done the SDR. But as Joey was talking, I was thinking about a project we've got coming up where because of the delivery deadlines, we do have to do the SDR for one deliverable first as a priority. And I've been kind of pondering the best way to approach that. But it also made me think that something that we do a lot of now, which is quite good. It's lucrative to the company, which is nice. Is a lot of people are doing a lot of bad HDR, which is failing tech review, and then we're being brought in to fix it, which is a nice job. We ideally it would have been cheaper for the client.
Are you getting like actual? Are they delivering like resolved project files to you? They're like, here's the project file, or
usually it's a variable depending on who's done it, but there's kind of fails tech review at broadcaster X, and then someone comes and gets in touch with us and says, we hear that you're on top of this sort of stuff, can you sort it out? And then we'll spend some time sorting it out, and ultimately always it's cheaper and you get a better result doing it right the first time. But it actually made me think, from the way Joey was talking about it, it could be actually a good advice for people new to HDR is actually to do their SDR and do the up trim, because they're probably going to be a bit more cautious about how they do it. A lot of the problems that we see in the bad HDR is where they've just treated HDR 1000 nits like it was video range, and they're working to those peaks, and it's just falling apart and blowing out the screen and that sort of thing.
I would like to clarify one thing. I do agree with you. The HDR first workflow is kind of my favorite way to go because I think you have more creative freedom in HDR, and I'd like to see a world where HDR is everything. I'm getting into this workflow for situations where it was an SDR grade from the beginning. HDR was not part of the equation. Yeah. Then down the road, they're like, oh, can we go to HDR? Archive stuff, old projects that if you worked in color management, you have that option. And
I think this is how most of us are getting. And I think this is how most of us are getting into HDR, right? I mean, you don't have the HDR reference display, so you're going to have to rent a monitor or go someplace, rent some time. So you start out with the SDR. That's what the original question was about too, is maybe, and a lot of it too is when you're talking to indie filmmakers, well, we hope to sell this to Netflix. We want to be able to offer them as part of the package a HDR with Dolby trims, right? So you're kind of planning for that workflow, but you may never execute that workflow. And that's for whom like this discussion is really all about. But yeah, I would agree that if you can start with the full creative palette of HDR and then work your way down to SDR, that's great. Now, there's one other question related to this that's in the chat from, I don't know how to say your name, Cower. What are your thoughts on what Walter Valpato does with Dolby? Now, I haven't heard Walter say this. So I'll assume this is true. analyze a grayscale ramp with the look and use its data for every shot instead of analyzing each one separately. There are thoughts on this. Who wants to pick that one up? Joey, you start. You laughed. You know exactly what's going on here.
I'm not sure I want to comment on this.
Because it's Walter, right? Who's any of us to talk about Walter, right? So, Zeb, you have any thoughts?
I mean, it's one of those things. If I don't try it, I'm never going to say something's wrong, but because it might not make sense to me, but actually in practice it might produce results that I'm impressed with. So, but I wouldn't take that approach.
I think it depends on the content of the image. Look, if it is a as tightly controlled workflow as some of the films that Walter does, where every shot is absolutely perfect, I can definitely see it working. I don't know what they've done in terms of metadata for some of those films. I know that doing the same metadata across the whole film is highly discouraged by Dolby and will fail QC and almost every distributor. So before you try doing some custom color management trickery with Dolby Vision, if you want to try something like that, check with your distributor, talk them through the technical details, and figure out a plan with them, because you don't want to be in a situation where you're at the end of the project, everybody's happy, you did some copy and paste trickery with the metadata, and then everything fails QC.
I will tell you that Dolby had a recent update to their certified people. They did a live stream talking about the next generation, the latest tools that are coming out. And they specifically addressed this question. And they said, do not do this. Because what you're saying is that every single shot, every single frame has the same average picture level, the same highlight, and the same black point. And you're defeating the process, the whole point of Dolby Vision, which is to map to individual screens based on the content, the actual live content, the active content on the screen.
And that kind of, like, if you knew every screen that it was going to play back on, that would work, right? But we don't. And that's the point of Dolby Vision. It is one master creative grade being played back at its best possible integrity on any Dolby capable display. And the dynamic metadata is a very important part of that. So yeah, in general, I would not do that. I think some of the films that Walter has described those kind of workflows on are special exceptions to a lot of workflow things,
Well, I think it's a couple of things, and Jamie, feel free to jump in here at any point if you want to. I think a couple things. I mean, with Walter, you look at the size of the budgets he's working on, you look at the quality of talent he's surrounded by, and is a movie chain going to fail? If he fails QC because he has the exact same metadata on every shot, and his company comes back and says, "No, this is right. This is exactly how we want it."
Yeah, they would just say
Netflix
that's how we want it to look.
This is exactly what we want from it. Netflix isn't going to complain, right? They're going to be like, "Yeah, okay, we pass QC." But if I do that, they'll be like, no, you're not Walter. And plus,
I think there's not necessarily a problem with that. I think the assumption would be that you don't know what you're doing. So you
don't know what you're doing. And I would suggest that if Walter and his team, and it's not Walter, it's his team is doing this, right? If his team has said this is how we're going to work, then they will specifically define their workflow to make sure it doesn't break Dolby Vision, right? And so they are working within those tight tolerances. They're making sure exposures, pre-production, they're figuring this stuff out in pre-production. They're doing their own custom, transforms. So sometimes it can be difficult to take that kind of advice of people who are working on budgets most of us will never dream of getting, right? And surrounded by teams of people we can't even begin to imagine to be hiring. And they can come up with their own custom workflows, and they can kind of tweak these technologies and not break them.
Yeah, the biggest thing I would say is, because I don't want to speak for Walter or anybody else, but from my perspective, the thing to do with any of these workflows and deliverables and QC and everything, just make sure you're very clear with your distribution partners and everybody else through the process. Don't surprise anybody, you know.
And just
if
be
you have
clear that if you
questions
follow
about
this,
the metadata requirements, talk to the distributor.
and you have to understand you are working in a non-standard workflow, and if things break, the first thing you're going to look at is say it's your analysis, right? That's going to be the default. It doesn't matter if it's a problem on their end. They're just going to say, you hacked the analysis, and it'll be on you to then convince them otherwise. Jamie.
And are you saying that the danger with that workflow is that you might think it's okay, but then when it's on a 750 nit domestic screen or something like that, the metadata won't map that correctly because it's just got this global. Right.
That's exactly the danger, because the displays that's what HDR and Dolby Vision is a fundamentally different way of encoding, transmitting, and displaying an image than what we've been used to in the past, right? Now the display does some of the work, and we're giving it creative metadata to explain how to do that work. That metadata is based on a standard, and if we don't adhere to that standard, there's always a risk of something going haywire.
All right, and then very quickly, before we move on to the next question, kind of on the same topic, almost. Is there a market for people? Jim asks in the chat, is there a market for people who take this on after the fact? Jim, I imagine you're asking, if I take this on, you're saying taking on the HDR mastering. There was a time when audio didn't go to be mastered, but then you ended up having, audio houses that specialized in mastering, right? You would do the mix and they'd come in and do the final master before pressing for the CD. You think that's a valid business model in our business? Zeb, I mean, you're kind of doing that. Just kind of,
I'd say so. I mean, it's effectively what we're doing. Someone's kind of, I guess they're failing a tech review for it to kind of end up at us. But yeah, if we were kind of existing as a place to kind of drop it off first to have a pass done before they deliver and sort of taking over on the deliverables and those requirements, then we sort of see it as our responsibility to do it right. Obviously, it's our reputation on the line when we're doing the delivery, and therefore it may be that we do a pass where we're effectively trying to make sure that the original creative intent is there, but we're not doing things that don't actually make sense to HDR.
Yeah, and using Jim's analogy of post-audio houses, when I had a shop in Manhattan, across the street from us was an post-audio house. Mastering is all they did. They're like, people come to us because we understand how to get the most out of compression, loudness. Like, they had this very narrow niche of, we do that final work for delivery, not the mixing. The final, like, how does it sound when it finally gets out there? And they had an entire business that was built specifically in that little niche. And it was, it was a healthy business. So, yeah, I can see.
Everything's just, it's easier and usually more cost effective if our sort of team that know what they're doing with this do it. And then it goes through to our mastering and delivery team, and things just turn over quick and easy. And whereas obviously if it comes through externally, then you're paying for additional passes that wouldn't have to be done if our talent had done it to begin with. So it's
I think it's a great thing for colorists, especially because there's a couple not all colorists are the same. I personally have invested a lot of time and money into being an early adopter of HDR and Dolby Vision. There are plenty of colorists who artistically are amazing, do fantastic work, way better than me, who have not made the choice to, invest the time and money into being an early adopter. Because that's what we are for HDR and Dolby Vision mastering in a lot of ways, right? We're early adopters.
Yeah, we're still in that early
aspect
phase
to it. It's not all, the art form that we're used to, So to bring on somebody who specializes in that part of the process, I think is great. If you are that specialist and you're working with other creatives that came before you on a project, I think, like anything else, communication is very important. If you do take on HDR finishing for something that's already graded, you as a colorist have to say, like, well, this grade is not my creative grade. You don't want to regrade it for HDR, right? You want to, like we were talking about, master it for HDR, respect the original creative intent. And a lot of that just comes down to communication and things like that.
All right,
I think you do get it where a lot of just to end that off.
Yep.
I think you get a lot of like Joey said, brilliant colorists who are not necessarily technical and haven't had to be in the past. They've been able to just go, I like the way those pictures look, and my clients like them too, and out they go. Once you bring in HDR and color management and these additional sort of technical layers to these things, that can kind of be a bit of a problem. But then a lot of colorists in that position might not be comfortable to say that they're not able to handle those things because they're a good colorist and they should, in theory, be able to. But it is out of their wheelhouse and sort of utilizing the people who specialize in these sorts of things. It does make sense to hand over at that point and have that done.
Just like many colorists for many years have hired other companies to make DCPs for them.
Yep.
Because they want it to be right. And they don't want to spend their life focusing on the intricacies of DCPs and bit rates and XYZ encoding and everything else. There's nothing wrong with that.
We actually pitch the trim passes as well as a technical pass to many of these sorts of things for that reason, because in many ways it is the creative intent is there. We have to just make sure that translates into SDR correctly.
All right, let's move on to question number 3. This is from Tony D. And his question was, how do you approach working on a docuseries workflow-wise shot with 3 to 4 different cameras and not have the original camera files only picture locked in ProRes 422HQ or 444? And then he writes some additional detail. First, he gives us some kudos. He says, you guys are awesome. I've learned so much since I joined Mixing Light. He's been coloring 4 years. He's curious how we would tackle an 8-episode documentary series shot with Sony FX6, Sony A7 III, drone. I do remote grading, so they send me a picture lock in ProRes 422HQ or 444. Prep work and figuring out the best smart workflow in terms of efficiency is taking the majority of my time. Yeah, this is my bread and butter. What about you guys?
Yeah, I've done a fair bit of this kind of thing. In fact, I did an insight recently.
I was just going to say, I think Jamie did an insight on sort of getting that. We're lucky that we get to work on camera originals predominantly, so we don't get as much of this as you guys. So I'll hand over to Jamie.
Jamie, why don't you give us a quick summary of what you talked about in that insight?
Well, I think the key takeaway is whether it's important for both workflows. If it's a preconform from a flat ProRes or however you do it, is get your real names from either from the EDL or from the clip attributes has a trick that you can take the real names and you can set a pattern. You want the real names to be the same for each shot, even if they were spanned clips or they'd been media managed, or indeed they came from an EDL. The EDL comments is the important thing.
And I did an insight on that. That's available as well.
Yeah, exactly. I think Patrick did one
all
as
three
well.
Of us.
The 3 of us.
Yeah. I'll when we post this, I'll put the series because I think I did something, then Joey was reacting, and then you were reacting. I think we kind of cascaded a series of insights of reactions.
Yeah, we happen to be working on similar kind of detective tasks at the same time. But yeah, when you've got the real names, you can, and then the C mode sort. Then if you can get adjacent reels next to each other on the timeline, then assuming that you know what one of them is, one of the camera input color space and the format, then you can flag them or color code them or whatever you need to do. Or I actually found that actually writing up the real name, the only way that you can see the real name quickly is using the data burning with the metadata variables. It would appear there, but not in the main real name number, because that would just take the real from the single flat ProRes. So it depends how you're doing it, but if you can group them like that, and you can identify this is from this real name, this is from any other, and then if you're using, I guess node-based color management works the best for this. You've got like, 4 or 5 different stills saved with the appropriate camera IDT or a color space transform to go from 709 because it's GoPro, and then this is the Sony. So you've got one set up to go from Sony to get it into your timeline working space, whatever that is, DaVinci wide gamut or whatever, and then you've got a standard ODT at the end to get from your DaVinci wide gamut or ACES or ARRI or whatever your timeline working space is. You've got that ODT at the end to go to 709 2.4. But it's all about getting those real names and figure out how to get those consistent, really.
Yeah, and I'll just say that this workflow is my favorite workflow for this type of client. I've got a 10-part series I'm starting to grade in probably about 3 weeks. It'll run through January. And this is the exact workflow. They're editing in Premiere, so they burn it. And ProRes 444 is my preferred codec. It ensures that no matter what camera they're using, you're encapsulating the full amount of color metadata that might be in there, because sometimes a client will be like, it's all 8-bit. Well, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Just go for ProRes 444. I'll get all of the, whatever file format you're shooting in, I know I've got every bit of data that camera recorded. In fact, on this documentary series that I'm working on, it's almost the exact same cameras that was mentioned in this question. And, my preferred workflow, which I've documented, so Jamie's documented what he talked about in an insight. I have an insight where I talk about how I have the editor break out. He burns everything into one timeline, into one file. He lays that on top of his edit, adds all the ad edits, and then moves out each clip to the right track. I have him have a track for each of the cameras. He moves the clip up to the right camera track, and he's looking at the file name to know what it is, because they all have very distinct file naming structures. So you can tell what each camera is. And he just puts that flat file that's been cut up, puts everything on different tracks. I bring in that EDL. I know what's on each track. And then I document how I can then use color management, set different input color spaces for each of those cameras. Even though it's coming from a single file, I show how I do that. And it's fantastic. It works great. And it works with project-wide color management or node-based color management. So you can do this workflow either way.
And for some things, groups can be really helpful. Put your input transform on. If you're not using groups for scenes or interviews, use groups for cameras. There's a million different ways you can skin that cat.
Yep. And we've covered this on Mixing Light, and I'll be sure to gather all this up into the post that accompanies this particular video. And we've got 5 minutes left. Zeb, did you have a final thought to say on there?
Yeah, I was just going to say, if you're able to, collaborate more with the teams dealing with the media and things like that, and we're kind of fortunate in that we tend to ingest the media for editorial, and we do that through Resolve, applying all the real names and everything like that, color management at that stage. So we then conform back in that project from whatever they cut in. So it doesn't matter what GNLE they're in. The media always comes through Resolve, bring back that timeline for the conform, and it's almost always a single click conform, as long as you've kind of done the work up the front to make it nice and clean and easy. So I'm a bit spoiled in that front.
I forgot that reminds me of a question I've been meaning to look into. When I get an EDL from Premiere, or I guess it's from Avid, it's the same. There's a check mark in the dialog when you export an EDL. You can say, put these items in the EDL comments. But am I right in saying that there's no dialog if you export an EDL from Resolve? I'm not sure you get those the source file name comment added to the EDL. I think Resolve
No,
just
Resolve
makes
EDLs are a little bit messy and complicated in terms of what track they output and all sorts of funkiness going on there. But it's Anyway, what was the last question, Pat? Before we run out of time.
The last question is: what is the important? This is from Chris K. What is the important metric for render cache speed in regards to hard drives? He writes, I'm juggling, he or she, I'm not sure. I am juggling between the idea to use a single NVMe SSD or a rated NVMe array as a dedicated render cache volume in DaVinci Resolve, which leads into my question, two-parter in regards to your hard drive. What is the important metric for render cache speed? Read-write speeds, IOPS, or something else? And then is there a theoretical limit which you can max out or fully saturate the render cache speed in DaVinci Resolve? Is a single NVMe more than enough?
I'm a big fan of these little single SSDs. You can get them, they're like a gig a second or 2 gigs a second. And I would think it's only playing back, in theory, one stream. For the most part, if you've cached it, that's one stream of video. I would think that would be plenty fast enough.
Yeah, we use them across the board, and they're getting so affordable now as well.
Are you the RAIDs or the single cards?
No, just single
just
NVMe drives. They're always kind of good enough read-write. But one of the added benefits is if you kind of start forcing stuff into your render cache, say you've got a lot of media on a drive that isn't particularly fast. Once that gets forced into your cache, then you obviously get the benefits of the speed of the cache. So you're not having to invest in really big, really fast storage. You can have really big storage, just standard, and then have the NVMe caching, meaning that you kind of gain benefits of playback and things like that from the render cache.
Specifically, there's a couple things I would like to add regarding the way Resolve caches. If you look in your cache clip folder, Resolve does cache as single image sequences in whatever format you are. So if you set it to ProRes, you have a bunch of DVCC files that are ProRes images, but it's still frame by frame. So yeah, modern NVMe is fast enough in all categories for this, except for very extreme situations like using uncompressed render caches. Then you might want to do an NVMe RAID. The question being, what's more important, read-write speed or IOPS? Both, because Resolve is rendering them to individual files, right? So it's not particular, like if you have an hour-long timeline that's cached, it's not one cache file. It's thousands of cache files. So you do want good IOPS performance because the file system is hitting file after file after file after file, one for every frame. So that does matter a little bit, but yeah, modern NVMEs just eat that stuff up.
Yeah, I personally run with a four NVMe RAID. I like that. Number one, it just gives you more storage, right? I mean, the limitation on most NVMEs is how much storage capacity you get per card, and prices escalate very, very quickly on NVMEs. So it gives me a little more storage. And the other reason, too, is precisely what Joey talked about. Remember, if you've got dissolves, picture-in-picture, well, now you're running 2 streams. Or 3 streams, right? If you do DPX
or
workflows,
node caching, you might be combining different things, you know. And I will say this: I don't believe in local caching. I'm kind of in the minority here, but I don't believe in local storage for anything, anywhere, ever. So what I do is I cache to my NAS, but my NAS has an NVMe read cache. So the NAS side is managing what's in cache, which is usually the cache clip folder. And there is a little bit of a performance hit there because you're not accessing it directly, obviously. But the advantage is if I have a project done on my Mac Pro and my Mac Pro is doing a big render and I need to go work on something on my Mac Studio or my other Windows box, I can open it up and all the caches that I made on the big Mac Pro, which is faster, are still there. Right.
And that's the use case for like a network attached render cache. So
yeah. I don't personally believe in having anything local to the machine, but there are downsides to that, specifically performance.
Is there a point when you're using HDR and you have to cache at floating point? Would that strain the bandwidth at any point?
Well, you don't necessarily need to cache HDR and floating point. There are DNX HR and ProRes HDR options that have enough precision in them that aren't floating point.
Okay.
If you want to get like more than that, that's when you click that little uncompressed option, and that's when all of your storage melts. Those are the cases where, yeah, I wouldn't do uncompressed 4K HDR floating point caches on a single NVMe. I think that would probably, you would want a RAID of NVMe's for that.
Right.
All right, guys. Anyone else, anything else to add to that, or we'll wrap this up? All right. So thank you, everyone in the studio audience. I apologize to YouTubers that once again I failed. Bad Patrick to get this
Blame
thing
the
streaming
hurricane.
on YouTube.
Hurricane.
No, I'm not going to blame the hurricane. I do not do that. I do not assign blame where it's not awarded. But so for MixingLight.com, Zeb Chadfield, Joey Deanna, Jamie Dickinson, I'm Patrick Inhofer. Thanks for joining us, and we will see you in our next office hours, which, by the way, is next Thursday as we get back on schedule. See you next time.
See ya.
Thank you.
And stopping